The candles in the long gallery at Whitmore Hall had been lit 2 hours early, and by the time the guests arrived, the wax had already begun to slump in the sconces, which meant the light fell crooked across the floor and across the girl carrying the water jug. Her name was Anne Selwyn. She was 23 years old, and 6 months earlier she had owned a house with a green door in the village of Ashbourne, and now she owned 2 aprons and a comb. The gown they had given her to serve in was not a gown, it was the remains of one. The hem had been cut away and reset badly. The sleeves had been shortened by someone in a hurry, and a long tear along the left shoulder had been closed with thread of the wrong color, so that a line of black stitching ran across the pale wool like a scar somebody had drawn on with a pen. It had been done deliberately. Anne knew this, the way she knew the weight of a full jug. The other maids at Whitmore wore plain gray and clean caps. She alone had been dressed in something ruined. Lady Constance Harrow, the Dowager, Countess of Whitmore, sat at the head of the gallery with her fan held at exactly the height of her collarbone, and when Anne passed she did not lower her voice. "That is the Selwyn creature," she said. "The bankrupt's daughter. We keep her out of charity, and she serves in what her charity has earned her." The fan moved once. The 2 ladies beside her looked, and then looked away. And that looking away was the worst part, because it meant the sentence had been accepted. Anne kept walking. The jug was heavy, and her hands were steady, and her face was hot, in a way that had nothing to do with the candles. At the far end of the gallery, near the terrace doors, a man in a dark blue coat had stopped in the middle of a conversation. He did not speak. He did not move toward her. He simply stopped, the way a clock stops, and the gentleman beside him had to say his name twice before he answered. Nobody in the room noticed. Anne noticed. She had spent 6 months learning to read rooms from below, and she knew the difference between a man who had seen a servant and a man who had seen something. What she did not yet know was that he had recognized the stitching. Not the woman. The stitching, and that recognition would cost him more than she could have guessed. Julian Vane, the Earl of Ravensmere, had come to Whitmore Hall for a reason that had nothing to do with the season, and everything to do with a promise he had made to a man now in the ground. He was 34. He had held the title for 11 months. He had the sort of face that people described afterward, without being able to describe, except for the eyes which were gray and the mouth which did not offer anything. He watched Anne cross the gallery and set the jug down at the sideboard. And he watched her adjust her left sleeve twice, and then a third time, pulling it toward her shoulder, in a gesture so practiced, it had stopped being a gesture and become a habit of the body. She was covering the black stitching. She was not aware she was doing it. Julian turned back to his conversation and said something about the roads from Bath. Later, if you had asked anyone at Whitmore Hall who the maid in the ruined gown was, they would have told you she was nobody, and that they had it on excellent authority from the Dowager herself. That is how a house decides a thing. 1 voice, 1 fan, 1 afternoon. Anne had not been born to carry water. Her father, Thomas Selwyn, had been a wool merchant of the middling sort, prosperous enough to buy her a piano and a French tutor, and a house with a green door, and foolish enough to stand surety for a partner who ran. When the debts came, they came all at once. The piano went first. The tutor stopped coming. The house with a green door was sold to a man who painted it brown within the week, and her father died in a rented room in November, with his hand around Anne's wrist, and 1 sentence left in him. "Do not let them make you smaller than you are," he had said. She had kept 2 things out of the wreck: a comb of yellowed bone that had been her mother's, and a folded sheet of music in her father's hand. The copying out of a slow air he had liked, made for her 12th birthday because he could not afford the printed edition. The music was useless. Now she had no piano. She kept it in her apron, anyway, folded to the size of a playing card, and she touched it sometimes through the cloth, the way other people touched a cross. Her mother's cousin was housekeeper at Whitmore Hall. That was how she came to be there. And that was the whole of her fortune. A distant cousin named Martha Bell, who had written 1 letter and taken 1 risk. Martha found her in the still room that night, scrubbing out a jug that was already clean. She had that gown cut on purpose, Martha said. I want you to know. I know it. I know it too. You could ask for Gray. I could. Anne set the jug down. And she would give me Gray. And everyone would see that I had asked, and then the gown would not matter, but the asking would. Martha looked at her for a long moment, and then she took the lamp and went to the door and stopped there. Your mother was the same, she said. It did not save her either. That was the 3rd week of Anne's service at Whitmore Hall. There would be 9 more. She slept in a room above the laundry, with a window the size of a hymn book and a bed that had been made for a smaller woman. The room held 2 things she cared about, and neither of them was the bed. On the sill she kept the comb of yellowed bone, laid straight, because a thing laid straight is a thing that has not been surrendered. In her apron she kept the music. Every night, she took both out and looked at them, and put them back, and every night, she told herself that this was inventory, and not devotion. The work began at 5. There were 31 grates at Whitmore Hall, and she was responsible for 11 of them, and the ash had to be out before the family woke, which meant she was on her knees in the dark, with a brush and a pail in a room she was not permitted to be seen in after 7. She learned the house from the floor. She knew which boards spoke. She knew that the 3rd stair from the landing had a crack. You could lose a hairpin in. She knew by the 2nd week exactly which of the 42 portraits in the long gallery had eyes that followed, and which did not. And she had decided that the ones that followed were the ones painted by men who had been afraid of their subject. There were small kindnesses. Sarah Cull, the scullery maid, saved her the heel of the bread. The boot boy told her when the dowager was coming down the passage, which he did by whistling 4 notes of nothing at all. Anne understood what these gestures were. They were the currency of people who had no other currency, and she took each one and paid it back in the only coin she had, which was her hands, and she did other people's mending after the candles were out, until her eyes ached. She mended everyone's clothing but her own. That was noticed, too, in the servants' hall, and nobody said anything about it, because to say it would have been to say the other thing. The house was in the grip of an arrangement. Lady Constance had a nephew, Mr. Roland Beck, and Roland had a claim upon a small parcel of Ravensmere land that had come loose in the late Earl's papers, and the dowager's entire plan for the autumn was to marry that claim to Julian's title through her granddaughter, Miss Georgiana Pike. Georgiana was 19, had been told since she was 6 that she was the correct choice, and was, in her own way, not unkind. She simply had never once been asked to consider that the arrangement might not happen. Julian had come to Whitmore to settle the parcel and leave. He had said as much to his steward on the road. He said it again to himself on the 2nd morning, standing at the terrace doors with his coffee going cold, watching a maid in a ruined gown carry a basket of cut roses across the lower lawn, stopping twice to shift the weight because the handle had broken and been mended with twine. He set the cup down and went out. She did not hear him until he was 10 feet away, and when she turned, the basket went sideways, and roses went into the wet grass. "Your lordship," she said, "I beg your pardon." He crouched and picked up the roses. All of them. It took some time. He was an earl, and he was on his knees in the wet grass gathering flowers, and Anne stood over him with her hands empty and her heart making an unreasonable amount of noise in her throat. He stood and put them in the basket, and did not give it back to her. "Where does this go?" "The morning room." "My lord, I can carry it." "I did not ask whether you could." He carried it. He walked at her shoulder across the whole length of the lower lawn, an earl and a maid and a broken basket in full view of 3 windows, and he did not say one word more. At the morning room door, he handed it to her and looked at her sleeve, at the black stitching for exactly as long as it takes to draw a breath. "Who mended that?" "I do not know, my lord, no," he said, "neither do you." He went away down the corridor. Anne stood in the doorway with the roses and her pulse going hard, and told herself very clearly and very firmly that a man like that noticed a thing the way a man notices a crooked picture. It was correction. It was not regard. She had learned already that hoping was a kind of debt, and she had had enough of debt to last her. Behind the second window, Lady Constance had watched the whole crossing of the lawn, and had lowered her fan, and had begun, quietly, to calculate. The dowager's method was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. She had run Whitmore Hall for 30 years on the principle that every person in it had a place, and that the place was for their own protection, and that a woman who forgot her place would be hurt by the world far worse than any correction Lady Constance might apply. She believed this sincerely. It made her far more dangerous than malice would have. So, she did not dismiss Anne, she promoted her. Anne was moved from the still room to the gallery service. She would serve at the dinners. She would stand behind the chairs. She would be in the ruined gown visible at every meal to every guest of the season, which meant that any eye that might have wandered toward her would have to wander toward her in front of 40 people. And no eye does that twice. She will be perfectly comfortable, Lady Constance told the housekeeper. She is used to being looked at. Her father was in trade. Martha repeated this to Anne in the still room word for word, because Martha had decided that Anne would hear the truth from someone who loved her, rather than from someone who did not. "She called you the bankrupt's daughter again," Martha said. In front of Mr. Beck. Anne folded a cloth, folded it again. "Then she is consistent," Anne said. The dinners were worse than the gallery. In the gallery she had moved. At the dinners she stood. She stood behind Georgiana's chair through 4 courses, while Roland Beck explained the Ravensmere parcel to a table that had heard it twice already, and while Georgiana laughed at the right times, and while Julian sat at the dowager's right hand and answered every question in 6 words or fewer and looked at nothing, except that he did look. Once, when the footman poured, and Anne's hand came into the light with the salt cellar, and the light found the crack across her knuckles where the lye had opened the skin, Julian's own hand stopped halfway to his glass. It hung there, half a second. Then it finished the motion. Anne saw it, and she took it, and she folded it up small, and she put it away with the music in her apron, and she told herself it was nothing. There were 11 such dinners between the 1st of September and the end of October, and she stood through all of them, and she could have drawn a map afterward of exactly where in each room the man in the dark blue coat had been sitting. She did not want to be able to do this. Her body did it without consulting her. When he came into a room, the air changed pressure, the way it does before weather, and she would find that she had already turned a half-inch toward the door before she had heard anyone announce him. She built defenses. She was good at it. She told herself that a hand stopping halfway to a glass was a man remembering an appointment. She told herself that a gentleman who carries a basket is a gentleman who is bored. She told herself that the difference between being seen and being noticed is the difference between being a person and being a curiosity, and that a curiosity is put down again as soon as the next one comes. Each of these was true of somebody. She could not make any of them true of him, and the failure sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. On the 4th of October, the dowager's guests played at cards in the drawing-room until 2 in the morning, and Anne carried coal in twice. And the second time, Georgiana looked up from her hand and said, "Thank you," in the voice of someone who has been taught to say it and means it, and has never once considered what it would be on the other end of it. Anne curtsied. Georgiana went back to her cards. Neither of them had done anything wrong, and that was somehow the most exhausting part of the whole season. There is a particular arithmetic to being poor in a rich house. You learn what things cost. You learn that a candle stub is worth keeping, that a torn glove can be worn inside out, that the coal in the servant's passage is measured. And you learn, above all, that being noticed is expensive. Anne had learned that lesson so thoroughly that she had begun to mistake it for the whole truth about herself. On the 9th of October, a boy fell in the kitchen yard. His name was Peter Cobb. He was 11, and he had been sent up a ladder to fetch down a hanging of pears that had gone too high, because he was small, and nobody thought about it. The ladder went. He came down onto the flagstones and broke his arm, in a way that was immediately and obviously wrong, and the yard filled with people who all had opinions. Roland came out of the side door with a glass in his hand and looked at the boy on the stones and said that the child should not have been up there, that the child had been careless, and that the child's family would, of course, be told. The kitchen went silent, because everyone in that yard, every scullery maid and boot boy and cook, understood in the same instant what "the family will be told" meant. It meant the boy's father worked the Whitmore stables. It meant a report of carelessness. It meant a family out by Michaelmas. And Anne, who had spent 6 months making herself small, knelt down on the wet stones in the ruined gown and put her hand under the boy's head and said clearly, to a room full of witnesses, "He did not go up on his own. Mr. Beck sent him. I heard it through the window, and so did Sarah Cull." Roland's face did something unlovely and slow. "You are mistaken. I am not. You are a servant." "I am also not deaf," Anne said, and she did not look up from the boy, and her hands were shaking and her voice was not. She had just spent every penny she had. She knew it while she was saying it. A servant who corrects a gentleman in a yard has finished her employment, and a woman with no employment and no family and a dead father has finished rather more than that. She said it anyway. She said it because a boy of 11 was going to be blamed for a thing he had not chosen, and she had recently learned exactly what it felt like to be blamed for a thing she had not chosen. She set the arm. She had watched a bonesetter work on her father's shoulder once in Ashbourne, in the good years, and she remembered it. She used a shelf batten and her own torn sleeve and Martha's apron strings, and Peter Cobb screamed once, and then held her wrist and did not scream again, and when it was done, she sat back on her heels in the wet, and the whole yard was quiet. Nobody had noticed the man standing under the arch of the passage. Julian had come down to the kitchen yard because he had heard the ladder go. He had been standing in the shadow of the arch for the whole of it. He had heard the sentence about the family being told. He had heard a maid in a ruined gown put her own living on the table for a stable hand's son. Without hesitation, without an audience she cared about, without any expectation whatever of reward. He did not step forward. He turned and walked back up the passage, and his face, if anyone had been there to see it, was not the face he wore at dinner. He went to his room and stood a long time at the window. Then he took a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat, held it without opening it, and put it back. If this story has taken hold of you, stay close to it. There is a room later where everything turns, and you will want to be there for it. The wound Julian Vane carried had a name, and the name was Edmund. Edmund Vane had been his elder brother. Edmund had been the Earl, and Edmund had been the one their father approved of, and Edmund had married a merchant's daughter out of Ashbourne in the spring of the year, and had been cut for it by every house in the county. Every house. Including, in a way that Julian would carry for the rest of his life, his own. Julian had been 29 and full of the reasoning of a second son with a career and a reputation. And when Edmund had written asking him to stand up at the wedding, Julian had written back that he could not at present on account of an obligation in town. There had been no obligation. He had been afraid. He had been afraid of a drawing room, of a fan held at collarbone height, of the particular temperature of a room that has decided. The letter he had written had been 3 sentences long. He had never seen his brother. Again. Edmund and his wife had taken a fever in a rented lodging near the coast 18 months later, and Julian had inherited an earldom and a house and a folded 3-sentence letter that had come back to him among his brother's effects, kept for some reason all that time. He carried it in his coat. He had never once read it since. The paper had gone soft at the folds. He knew that without opening it, the way one knows the shape of a key in a pocket. In the 18 months between the wedding he did not attend and the fever, he had composed a great many second letters, in his head, on horseback, at his club, at 3 in the morning. He had written none of them. There had always been a better week coming. He had believed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never yet lost anything, that a person he had known his entire life would go on existing in the same direction for as long as he required. And that apology was a thing one could file at leisure. He had learned otherwise on a wet Tuesday, from a steward with his hat off. The first thing he had done as Earl was to have the portrait of his brother's wife taken down from the gallery at Ravensmere. He had told himself it was because he could not bear it. It had taken him 9 months to understand that the county had cut her while she lived, and he had cut her once she was dead, and that the two acts were the same, act performed by the same man in the same handwriting. He had put the portrait back in March. He had gone alone and carried it himself, and hung it slightly crooked, and left it crooked, because straightening it would have been a kind of tidiness he had not earned. That was the man who walked into Whitmore Hall in September and saw black thread across a woman's shoulder. And he had learned, in the way a man learns a thing too late to use it, exactly what a room did to a woman it had decided was beneath it. He had watched it done to a merchant's daughter from Ashbourne. He had helped by being absent. Then he had come to Whitmore Hall and seen a gown cut on purpose, and black thread run across a shoulder like a sentence. The season at Whitmore built toward the harvest ball on the 1st of November. The dowager had been building toward it since August. There would be 42 guests, an orchestra of 9, terrace doors thrown open to the cold, and, at some point between the second and third sets, an announcement of an engagement between the Earl of Ravensmere and Miss Georgiana Pike, which Lady Constance had not asked Julian to consent to because she did not believe consent was a thing one asked for. In this matter she believed it was a thing one arranged, and then a thing one performed. 3 days before the ball, she summoned Anne to the morning room. "Sit," she said, which was itself a weapon, because there was nowhere to sit. Anne stood. "You have been noticed," Lady Constance said, "and it is my duty to tell you that being noticed is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to you. Men of his rank notice a great many things. Horses, weather, a crooked hem. You would not survive being a thing that had been noticed, and then set down again, and he would set you down, because that is what the world is made to do, and you have not the standing to prevent it." She adjusted a ring. "I am not unkind. I am telling you the truth, which no one has done for you since your father made his ruin. My father did not make it. He guaranteed a man who did. That is a distinction that comforts you and interests nobody." Anne said nothing. "You will serve at the ball," Lady Constance said, "in that gown, and you will see him announced, and you will see what the correct arrangement looks like, and afterward you will be grateful to me. Girls always are, eventually." She lifted her fan. "Poor creature," she said almost gently. "The bankrupt's daughter, standing at the wall with the water. You will thank me for the cure." That was the 3rd time Anne had counted without meaning to. Some part of her had been keeping the tally the way one keeps a tally of blows. She went back down to the still room and stood with her hands flat on the cold stone table until they stopped. What Lady Constance had not accounted for was that Julian had spent the preceding fortnight doing something she had no category for. He had been reading papers. He had gone to the parish at Ashbourne. He had asked to see the account of the Selwyn bankruptcy, and the register, and the surety bond. And he had come away with the name of the partner who had run, and a date, the sum, £4,200. He had put a solicitor named Mr. Hale on the road to Bristol. He had done it quietly, and he had done it without telling Anne because he had understood, standing under that kitchen arch, that a woman who would not ask for a grey gown would not accept a rescue, and that the only gift she could receive was one that restored a fact rather than conferred a favor. He had also, on the 16th of October, asked Martha Bell one question in the corridor outside the linen room. "Does she still have anything of his?" Martha, who had worked in great houses for 30 years and had never once been asked a question by an earl that was not about linen, considered him for a long moment. "A piece of music," she said. "In her apron she thinks nobody knows." Julian nodded once and went away. 2 nights before the ball, Anne came up the back stairs at 11 with a lamp and found him in the library. He was standing at the long window with his back to the room and his hands behind him, and the fire had gone low, and there was no possible reason for either of them to be there. My lord, I did not know the room was in use. It is not. She should have gone. She stood in the doorway with the lamp, making a small circle of light around her ruined sleeve, and did not go. Come in, he said. Close the door. It is cold. She came in. She closed the door. Every rule she had been raised inside stood up and objected, and her feet went anyway. And this was the thing she would think about afterward, that her body had crossed the room before her mind had finished refusing. He turned around. Miss Selwyn, he said. She had not been called that in 6 months. Not once. The syllables went through her like cold water through a crack. I am not, she said. Not here. You are wherever I say the word. That is not how it works, my lord. No, he agreed. It is not. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He stopped an arm's length away, which in that library at that hour was a distance with a name, and the name was Scandal, and he did not close it. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for long enough that the fire settled in the grate and the sound made her flinch. Your sleeve, he said. It is only thread. It is not. His voice did not rise. It was cut, and it was mended badly on purpose, so that every person in this house would see it and know what they were meant to think. That is a sentence written on a woman's shoulder. I have seen it done before. Anne's throat closed. Then you know it works, she said. I know it worked once. He looked at her, and something in his face gave way an inch, and for the first time she saw that he was not cold. He was holding. It is not going to work here. He lifted his hand. It came up between them and stopped, 3 inches from the black stitching, and hung there, and did not land. She could feel the warmth of it across the gap. She could feel her own pulse in her jaw. Neither of them moved. It went on far past the point where either of them could have pretended it was nothing. I should say that I want to see you decently dressed, he said very low. That is what I should say. I would be permitted to say that. Then say it. It would not be true. His hand was still there. What is true is that I have thought of nothing else for a fortnight, and that when you knelt on those stones for that boy, I understood that I had been living my entire life as a coward, and that I want you, Anne, which is a thing I have no right to and no way to make decent. And I am telling you because I have already been silent once when it mattered. And a man does not get to make that mistake twice. Her name. Not Miss Selwyn. Her name in his mouth. Lo, once. She had 100 defenses, and every one of them was for a different attack. You do not know what I am. I know what you did on the stones. That was not virtue. That was temper. Then I want your temper. She put her hand up. She did it without deciding to. Her fingers came to rest against his, the 2 hands meeting in the cold air between them with nothing else touching at all. And she felt the shock of it go down her arm and into her ribs, and she heard herself make a small sound she had not authorized. Then she stepped back. They will destroy you, she said. Do you understand what she will do? Yes, you have 11 months of a title, and 1 scandal will take it apart. She has 30 years. She has every drawing room in the county. You will be cut, and you will find out that a man can be an earl and still be nobody. And you will look at me across some cold room in 4 years, and you will know exactly what I cost, Anne. I have been the reason a man lost everything, she said, and her voice broke for the first and only time. My father guaranteed a friend, and it killed him. I have watched what it costs to be the thing somebody chooses. I will not be that again, not for you, not for anyone. She was at the door. She did not remember reaching it. I am not asking your permission, he said. She went out and closed it, and she stood in the black corridor with her hand over her mouth for a long time. The harvest ball at Whitmore Hall began at 9 on the 1st of November. And the terrace doors were open despite the cold, because the dowager considered cold air an aid to complexion. 42 guests, 9 musicians. Candles in every sconce, and the wax standing straight this time, because this time it had been done properly. Anne stood at the wall by the sideboard, with the water in the ruined gown, exactly where she had been placed. She had decided to endure it. She had decided this at 4 a.m, with her father's music unfolded on her knee in the dark, and she had refolded it and put it away and washed her face and gone up to work. The ball was the largest event Whitmore Hall had staged in a decade, and the house had been at war with itself for a week to produce it. 900 candles had been counted out of the storeroom and counted again. The floor of the ballroom had been chalked at dawn, so the dancers would not slip, and the chalk had come up on every hem in the servants' hall. The orchestra had arrived from Bath at 4 and had been fed in the kitchen and had complained about the cold with the frankness of men who are paid whatever happens. Sarah Cull had cried twice, once over a dropped tureen and once for no reason anybody could name. Anne had carried, by her own count, 41 buckets of coal that day. At 8, she went up to the laundry room and stood in front of the small square of polished tin that served the maids for a glass. The gown looked back at her. The black stitching ran across the shoulder exactly as it had run across it for 9 weeks. Deliberate, legible, a sentence in a hand she had never been permitted to answer. She thought about the library. About a hand that had come up and stopped 3 inches from that thread and had not landed. About what he had said, and the fact that he had said it out loud, in a house that punished saying things out loud, when he could simply have gone on being an earl in a warm room for the rest of his life. She thought about her father in the rented lodging in November. Do not let them make you smaller than you are. She had been reading that sentence for 6 months as an instruction to endure. Standing in front of a square of tin at 8 o'clock on the 1st of November, with a ball roaring into life 2 floors below her, she understood for the first time that it might have been an instruction to refuse. She did not know yet what she would do with the understanding. She put her cap on straight and went down. At 10:30, Lady Constance rose, and the orchestra thinned to nothing, and 42 faces turned. "My friends," she said, "you have been very patient with an old woman's arrangements. Gives me a joy I did not expect at my age to tell you that Whitmore and Ravensmere are to be joined at last. My granddaughter Georgiana, the Earl of Ravensmere." She turned toward him with her hand extended, and her fan closed. Julian did not take it. He set down his glass. The click of it on the marble carried the length of the room. And then in front of 42 people and 9 musicians and a dowager with her hands still out, he crossed the ballroom. Not toward Georgiana. He crossed the whole floor. He went past the dowager's hand and past the rival in ice blue silk, and past every face that had spent 6 months deciding what Anne Selwyn was. And the room turned as he went, the way a field turns in wind, and he stopped in front of a maid in a ruined gown holding a water jug. He took the jug out of her hands and set it on the sideboard. The silence was so complete that Anne could hear the candle nearest her guttering. "This is Miss Anne," Julian said. "She has consented to be my wife." 12 words, level, not loud. He had not asked her. She had refused him 2 nights before, in a library. She understood, standing there with her empty hands, that he had done it in the one arena where the refusal could not be private and the cost could not be his alone, and that he had done it knowing she might contradict him in front of 42 people and finish him. She did not contradict him. Lady Constance said, "That is not." She stopped. She said, "You cannot." "She is." Her hand was still out. Her fan had not opened. "She is the bankrupt's." And then there were footsteps, and a small dry man in traveling dress came in from the passage, with his hat in his hands, and every head swung again. "Mr. Hale," said Julian without turning. "You were late." "The Bristol Road, my lord." Mr. Hale bowed to the room in general, entirely unbothered, and produced a paper. Sworn before the magistrate at Bristol, on the 28th of October, the surety on the Selwyn bond was discharged by fraud. The partner has confessed and is in custody. £4,200, with the estate of Thomas Selwyn restored in full to his heir. I am to say that the parish at Ashbourne has entered it. Nobody spoke. She was never a bankrupt's daughter, Julian said. She was a robbed man's daughter. This house, said the other thing, for 6 months, at a volume it chose, and it will now hear this, at the same volume. Georgiana, 19 years old, looked at her grandmother's face, and then at Anne's, and then she did a thing nobody in the room had prepared for. She stepped out of the group, walked into the middle of the floor, and dropped a small, correct, perfectly public curtsy to a maid. "Miss Selwyn," she said. That was the moment the room broke. A woman by the terrace doors did the same. A gentleman set down his glass and inclined his head. It went across the ballroom like the first crack across ice, quiet, spreading, and Lady Constance Harrow stood in the middle of it with her hand out and her fan closed and 30 years of arithmetic coming apart in her chest, and she understood, at last, and far too late, that she had been the only person in the room who had never actually looked at the girl. She sat down. It was not graceful. It was simply that her legs stopped. Roland had already left by the side door. He was not seen at Whitmore again. Julian turned back to Anne. The whole room was watching, and he did not appear to know it. "You said I would be cut," he said low for her. "You will be. Then I will be cut with you. I find I do not mind it." Anne stood in a ruined gown in the middle of a silent ballroom, and felt the 6 months come off her all at once, and she did not weep, and she did not gloat, and she did not say anything clever. She put her hand into his, in front of everyone, with the black stitching plain on her shoulder for every eye in the county to read. "Then you had better ask me properly," she said, "somewhere warm." The first snow came to Ravensmere on the 11th of December. The house was smaller than Whitmore and older, and it faced south, and the morning room had a window that took the whole of the light, and it was in that room, on that morning, that Anne found the piano. It had not been there the day before. It was not new. It had been Edmund's wife's, brought down from an attic where it had stood under sheets for 4 years, and it had been tuned by a man from Bath, who had come out in the snow to do it. Julian was standing by the door with his coat still on. Anne did not say anything for a while. Then she took the folded sheet of music out of her pocket, the same folded card of paper she had carried through 6 months of stone floors and lye and black thread, and she opened it out flat on the stand, and the creases would not lie down, and she pressed them with her palm the way her father used to. "He copied it himself," she said. "He could not afford the printed one. I was 12. "I know," Julian said. "Martha told me the tempo." She played it. Not well. Her hands were still cracked, and there were 6 months of no practice in them, and she stopped twice, and the third time she got it to the end, and the snow came down past the window, in the great warmed quiet, and Martha, who was now housekeeper at Ravensmere, and who had brought the tea in and forgotten to put it down, stood in the doorway with the tray and did not say a word. The last chord went out into the room and stopped. Julian had not moved from the door. He had a folded 3-sentence letter in his coat that he had carried for 2 years, and he had burned it in the library grate on the night they arrived, and he had not told her, and one day he would. On the stand the paper held its creases and refused to lie flat, and the snow kept coming, and her father's handwriting sat in the light of a window that was hers. Anne left her hand on the keys. "Thank you for staying to the end of it. If she found her way into you somewhere, sit with it a moment before you go."